I had the wonderful opportunity to work with Jared and Michelle quite a few years ago now on the cloud documentation team. But Michelle has been leading the DORA research into documentation. And Jared, he kind of started out the cloud documentation for Google Cloud and did a lot in the Kubernetes space. And now he's over at Waymo, and he'll share more about that in their presentation. So I'll hand it over to Michelle and Jared.
All right, let's get going. I'm Michelle Irvine, so I'm a technical writer in Google Cloud, and as Amanda said, I've been spearheading the documentation section of the DORA research. And Jared, do you want to introduce yourself just quickly?
Sure. My name is Jared Bhatti. I'm a tech writer currently leading documentation at Waymo, and before that, I was leading documentation on Google Cloud and open source Kubernetes.
So in this talk, we are going to do two things. So first of all, I'm going to go through some of the DORA research, the findings that are focused around documentation. And so I'll give you a little bit of context into the research program. I know we're all familiar with it, but just to kind of set the context for the findings. And then the second section, Jared's going to give us some information and just guidance from on the ground about actually creating quality documentation and creating a culture that's conducive for quality documentation. So let's get started. The DORA research program, it's been going on since 2014. And over the years, we have over 33,000 professionals who have responded. So that's a lot of data. And then each year, it's a mix between new investigations and new findings mixed in with revalidating things that we've looked at before. So the documentation section has been included in 2021 and 2022, and then it'll also be included in the 2023 research. So we do have a handful of years of data about this, which is exciting. And the research program, we are part of Google, but the research is not focused on Google. It's focused on people across the industry. So different companies, different contexts, and all over the world. So this image is from the 2022 report. So this is just to kind of give a taste of like the amount of responses and the differences in everybody's context. Another thing is that this isn't just focused on the technology sector or people who are producing software as their main product. There's a varying amount of industries. So this slide, hard to read, but you can go take a look at the reports. This is from 2021 and 2022. It just gives a sense of all the different industries that people respond from. So this includes technology for sure, but also like financial, retail, education, government, nonprofit, healthcare. So what we're seeing and the findings that we're seeing really impact many different industries. So this isn't just about selling software. This is software empowering all these different industries. And the last thing I want to point out about the research program is that we look at lots of things. So these are all these different constructs and things that we investigate and look at interactions. This diagram also will be a bit hard to read because of the size, but it just gives you a sense of all the different things that we look at and the different kind of complicated relationships that we're able to kind of untangle. And this diagram too, so this is the 2022 report, so you can go take a look at that. It's also online at dora.dev. Even the lines here are fairly simplified, right? So we're finding kind of like interactions and other things too that aren't necessarily all laid out in this one image. All right, so let's talk about documentation. So the first thing that we need to do is figure out how to measure documentation. And in this case, we're calling it documentation quality. So quality can sound fairly nebulous, and it can be fairly nebulous, but we have a very specific way that we've defined it and measured it for this research program. Another thing that I want to point out too is that when we're talking about documentation here, this research section has specifically looked at internal documentation. So this is the content that you or other people in your organization, developers, operators, anyone with a technical role, it's the content that you're reading and writing yourselves for your team members or other people in your organization. So this is different from end user documentation. And end user docs may also be in the mix, right? So that might be part of the product that you're developing. But this research section is specifically focused on internal documentation. So let's see how we can measure it. The DORA research program is a survey. So we have one question that's focused on documentation quality. This means that what we're talking about, and when we talk about doc quality, is not like we haven't gone in and read your docs. We're not going through and grading things like up or down, page by page. This is one question that's kind of assessing the entire documentation experience from the respondent's perspective, which is powerful, I think, because it kind of gives us a view into the whole set of content and the experience interacting with it. And it's also getting information from someone who is likely reading this content, which is what tech writing is meant for, right? It is content that is used by the reader to do something else. So we use 8 metrics to assess documentation quality. And I'll go through the attributes here, like the different metrics. But if you want to look at the exact statements that we use, those are also published, and the URL is at the bottom there. So is the documentation reliable? Like, can you rely on it when you need it? Is it clear? Are the words on the page able to be understood? Can you find it? Because the best documentation is not the best documentation if you can't find it. Does it cover everything that it needs to cover? Is it well organized? Is it up to date? Is it accurate? And is it relevant to what you're trying to do? So from this, we are able to take all the responses to each of these statements and then aggregate it into one number. So we get one number from 0 to 1. And it really defines your entire documentation experience. And one thing that's kind of cool about this is that because of how we're asking it and kind of like this zoomed out view of your entire documentation experience, I would say it even captures like situations where content is missing, right? Because if you say that it's not reliable, it's not findable, maybe that means that there's a chunk of content missing. So that's a bit more powerful in a way than grading page by page. Okay. Oh, another thing I want to mention about this is that these different attributes, they all load really well together, which means that in the data, we really see these kind of all occur or be missing kind of in the same at the same time. So if respondents are saying that the documentation is not reliable, then they're pretty much usually saying that it's also not relevant, it's also not accurate, it's also not findable. And then on the flip side, if something is reliable, then we're really seeing all these other attributes appearing as well. So in the documentation community, sometimes there's like different arguments about like what's more important, that the content is functional or well organized or clear. And it kind of shows that like, well, we're just all talking about the same thing. Like these things all really appear together. And even though we can kind of like differentiate them all, they're really kind of all feeding into the same thing. So if a documentation is usable, like all of these different attributes are coming up together. All right, so we've been able to measure the documentation quality and we give it one number. And this is where we get into some of the fun bits, because like you remember from before, our model was really big. We have all these different things. Documentation was like one little bit of the entire system. And so what we can do is throw it into the mix and see how it interacts with everything else. And the main tagline, which we use for the title of this talk, is documentation is like sunshine. And I'll explain where that simile is coming from a little bit further in the findings. But the first thing, let's go back to 2021, the first time we added documentation to this research study. And here is the SEM model, also published on DORA.dev from 2021. So as you can see, there's a whole bunch of different constructs and things that we're looking at, both cultural and technical. And then a bunch of different outcomes, including software delivery performance and organizational performance. So when we add documentation into this, what we saw was that it was really foundational to every single technical capability that we were looking at. So dot quality, like that one dot quality number, is predictive of teams successfully implementing every single technical practice that we saw. So from continuous testing to trunk-based development. The 2021 report we published some of the specific numbers to do with this. So this is the other cool thing that I think that a lot of people love about the DORA research, and I love about the documentation section of the DORA research, is that we're quantifying these things, right? So we're not just saying like, oh, this looks like it matters, but we can say things like teams with quality documentation are 3.8 times more likely to implement security best practices, 3.4 times more likely to implement SRE, so site reliability engineering best practices. And you're actually seeing like the numbers that go with that impact. So this same finding we've found again in 2022. So I've just zoomed into the part where we show documentation quality. And here again, we see it driving like the different technical capabilities that we've looked at. So from the outset, I have to say, like, it's pretty wild. Those numbers are big. And as a technical writer, like, I was really excited to see both this impact, like to see it actually, to see it in like in a model like this, and then also to be able to quantify it. And then in 2022, when we went back through some of the data, we found something that was a bit even more exciting, arguably more exciting. So this is where the documentation and sunshine comes in. To explain this, let's step back first and talk a bit about interactions. So interactions in a system, they can be described as the effect of X on Y depends on Z. So for example, we might say that more water, X, impacts the size of a plant, Y, but only if there is also light, so sunlight, Z. So testing for interactions like this, it can be tricky and complicated and you need enough data, but it can also be crucial in understanding how a complex system works. So by looking at interactions, we found a clear link between documentation quality and organizational performance. And organizational performance is the organization's ability to meet their performance and profitability goals. So this includes, performance and profitability goals, This includes things like profitability and customer satisfaction. So let's take a look at this. We've got a graph. So here we're looking at 3 different sets of information. These are all sets of simulations. And the bottom section here, the red one, is teams with below average documentation quality. So this is 1 standard deviation below average. And then the top one, the green, is 1 standard deviation above documentation quality. So on the x-axis here, we've got integration. And on the y-axis, we've got organizational performance. So let's take a look at this red. And as we see teams implement continuous integration practices, we do see on average like some lift, like some impact to organizational performance. But then if we look at the group that's working in an environment with quality documentation, we see this lift and it's significantly amplified. So quality documentation like really impacts how these technical capabilities are able to influence the overall organizational performance. And remember, this is the organizational performance of healthcare, retail, finance. Like this is an impact on the actual like larger organization's ability to deliver whatever it is they are delivering. So this is pretty cool. And again, we can quantify this. So this table has numbers for all of these different interactions. And this example here, sorry, I'll get to the table. This example here is continuous integration, but just like the previous findings, we saw the exact same thing happen with every single technical practice that we looked at. So this is information from 2022, and these are the different technical capabilities. And here are the numbers. So there's a lot going on here, which is why interactions are a little tricky. But let's break this down. So the first column, these are teams with below average documentation quality. And we'll jump to trunk-based development because it's got the biggest numbers. And we see that in this environment, so with poor quality docs, a team that's successfully implemented trunk-based development does see higher org performance compared to a team that hasn't. And the difference is about 36%. If you look at the teams that are working in an environment with good quality documentation, that lift is 1,525%. Like, it's wild. And I did pick the biggest number there, but if you go line by line, you'll see that they're all like completely different orders of magnitude. Like, this impact is very significant. Yeah. So that's the excitement from the documentation section of the DORA research. And if you want to, we might be able to get into this in the discussion bit a bit, but if you want to read a little bit more about what might be behind this impact, there's a blog post where we published some of this. So I've linked that. Oh, perfect. Thanks, Dave. It's also in the speaker notes when you get this deck. All right. So next, what we're going to do is we're going to jump over to Jared. And so from the DORA research, we can see documentation matters, and we're seeing like huge impacts and numbers. And Jared can give us some information from on the ground about actually creating quality documentation.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of where the rubber meets the road for the stats and theories that were done by Michelle around the DORA report. So I'm drawing upon my experience creating documentation for Waymo and Kubernetes and Google Cloud. And I'm going to try to distill a lot of knowledge from a decade and a half worth of work in the industry into a few slides. So it's going to be pretty high level. But feel free to ask questions and dig into this once we get to the Q&A. What I want to focus on, though, is if you are an organization that perhaps doesn't have the best documentation, here are some of the ways that you can start, evaluating what you're doing and start working towards the quality documentation that Michelle is describing. So next slide. So I tend to think about documentation, and in my approach, I always start with a mission, a goal of what we want to do with documentation. Specifically with internal documentation, I usually start with a mission that looks something like this. So at Waymo, it's increasing developer productivity and knowledge sharing to produce a reliable, safe Waymo autonomous vehicle. And with Kubernetes, it was reliable, stable, and consistent Kubernetes launches. So these are ways in which I think about framing the problem and creating a scope for the work. So you want to build those technical capabilities that Michelle was describing in the research. And most of those I consider things that increase developer productivity and knowledge sharing. So this is a way of containerizing the work that you're focused on as you start moving forward. Next slide. The next thing that I work on primarily with organizations is agreeing on a shared set of terms. So when I started working on documentation for Kubernetes, one of the first things we did was build a glossary. And this helped us standardize on terms because many different groups within the organization were using the same terms we're using different terms to mean the same thing. And so people were talking at cross purposes, and it was very difficult to get agreement. So something as simple as building a glossary, and I want to really emphasize a singular. When I started working at Waymo, we actually had maybe 6 or 7 glossaries, which was not great. And a lot of my work was focused initially on consolidating all of that and getting org-wide agreement on terms. There's also, as you grow and as you consider external audiences, having terms that you talk about externally versus internally is a useful barrier to consider as you create these terms. You don't want to try to define the terms that your external audience wants to read are going to be different than the internal ones. So we have a number of different terms for the Waymo driver, whether it's an autonomous vehicle or the software stack running inside the car or the hardware that we use internally that we really don't want to confuse an external audience with. So we separate out those terms. Next slide. So when it comes to building your library, once again, I really want to emphasize a library, a singular place for your content. And this is where the quality aspects of reliability and findability of content are really important. So having a single place, searchable, that people can find your content in and know confidently that if the information exists, it will be in this location. That's the purpose of your library. It's also important to think about minimum viable library. So what is the tool chain that's required for your library, and not getting overly complicated. Within Google, across Google, we use a system called G3 Docs, which is built on Markdown and uses a static site generator. Externally with Kubernetes, we use a similar system that's Markdown and built using a static site generator. I wouldn't overthink this. There are many, many tools out there. Many people are trying to solve the docs problem, but I very much recommend picking something that aligns with your existing tool chain if you already have one, and using a docs-like code process that builds on the knowledge that people in your organization already have. So we chose a system that uses Markdown because everyone within Google and Waymo, for the most part, is a software developer, very comfortable using a source code control system to check in our docs and revise them. And that also bakes in a lot of analytics and edit dates and line-by-line accountability for the content that we then can use for analytics and reliability. Next slide. So a bit more, digging in a bit more about in the library and creating content and having accountability. It's important to integrate your docs integrate the docs process into existing processes that you have. So in cloud, for example, and in Kubernetes, this is external, so you can look this up yourself. When you look at an RFC for Kubernetes, or a design doc, we ask that people consider what changes might affect external users that they'll have to create docs for. So baking doc considerations into the initial feature design is a really useful way to get people to think about how will they have to educate other people and share knowledge about the feature that they're building to others, and think about it in the initial phases of design. This also, in turn, I have found helps people consider the complexity of what a user might have to think about when it comes to using whatever feature it is people are building. And that tends to make people a bit more aware of complexity, work towards simplification, and really keep a user in mind when it comes to designing a new feature. And then when it comes to launching, in cloud, for example, we would require people to have documentation before they launched, and we could block a launch if they didn't have documentation. This is also true in Kubernetes in the open source world. Before something could go out in a release, it had to be documented. And the person shepherding the release would have to coordinate with the person creating the feature that was part of the release and verify that there was content. So baking the accountability into the process actually helps you keep your documentation up to date and prevents you from releasing features that don't have any docs. And then of course, like documents get a lot of technical debt, just like code. So it's important to treat them like code, even internally. So giving people the ability to submit user feedback. If somebody sees an issue with the doc, can they submit a GitHub issue or a bug against that content? That's very easy to bake into documents, especially if you're using a static site generator. We also use freshness checks, which are basically like we look at the publication date and the last edited date of the document. And if it hasn't been updated in a significant amount of time, say 6 months, it kicks an email reminder to the owner of that document to say, hey, is this up to date? We also use analytics to verify that the content is still relevant. So if nobody's looking at the document and it hasn't been updated in a while, and we've got a few pieces of user feedback against it that indicate that it's, out of date and not accurate, then maybe it's time to deprecate. So we also clean out our content on a regular basis. Just like you might scrub your code. If there's code that's like not being used, you might remove it. Next slide. So processes don't exist in a vacuum. So these processes must be supported overall by your organization through cultural and leadership support. So next slide, please. And this could look like a number of different things, but it's important to have a culture that supports documentation, because just having the processes won't get you all the way there. To build the technical capabilities that Michelle was describing, that were supported in the DORA report, you really need to have content that is regularly updated and maintained and supported. And this includes things like having a lead for your content, somebody who is a single point who owns the knowledge experience of your organization. And this could be an informal role. It could be an engineer that's doing it as a part-time work if you're a small org or a small team. And it could be somebody like me who is like, this is their full-time job. They have tech writers reporting to them, and this is what they do. Giving recognition. Recognition is a huge part of why people do docs. Like your name is on the doc. Maybe you get an email, a reward or something about it. That helps support the content. Some enforcement around the policies and standards and styles that you have. Like if like one of the problems with having docs like code is very easy to shard off a doc set and publish it somewhere else. And really having people try to keep things consistent, keep everyone on the same page is important. I've definitely had to play whack-a-mole with a few glossaries that people have spun up outside of like the main one at Waymo, and just like being able to say, hey, like, please don't do that. There's a reason why we have one. It also requires like time, investments of time and investment occasionally of engineering resources, whether it's to produce the necessary tooling for publishing and findability, making sure that you're well integrated with search and that you have like a good publishing tool chain, and to give people the time to review content, make sure it's up to date. Like we set aside time to, over the holidays, sort of a slow time, we're not doing a lot of launches at Waymo, to review a lot of lower priority doc issues that people have filed and clean them all up. So we just do a like top to bottom bug scrub of all of our docs. And that's a good time for us to do it. We schedule it, we provide time for people to do it, and we give recognition for people who have closed a lot of the doc issues that surfaced. So this is just a snapshot of some of the processes and ways in which we try to align with some of the research that has come out through DORA. And feel free to take some of these, run with them. And if you have questions about them, feel free to chime in during the Q&A. And with that, I'll turn it over to Michelle for the wrap up.
Thanks, Jared. So the main thing that I want everyone to get out of the content today is that documentation matters. So this work because it is work that is behind having quality documentation to both create it initially and maintain it and keep it up to date. It's technical work, and it has a huge impact both on technical practices and the technical practices' ability to impact organizational performance. So I would really love for you all to use this information, use these research findings to advocate for technical documentation work, to validate the work that's already happening on your team, in your org around technical documentation. And I also want to emphasize, and this touches on a lot of what Jared was talking about, that no matter where your documentation quality is at, that you can always take practical steps to improve it. Even if you're on the high end and you've got amazing documentation quality, like, it's not a static thing. It's not going to just be sit there and continue to be relevant. You need to make sure that you are constantly working on your technical documentation. And if you have poor quality documentation, there are also practical, concrete steps that you can take to improve that documentation quality. And then Jared has put together, or we both put together, a handful of resources. There are tons more, but we just wanted to give you like the tip of the iceberg here and some good places to start. Jared, do you want to give a quick rundown? This is the last.
Yeah, so of course there's the DORA research. There's also a list of tech writing resources that Google has created around mostly focused on external documentation, but also a number of classes that Google has created, and a style guide. Like, I briefly touched on style guides, but it's useful to have a place that you can point to and say, people have already thought about documentation, and we're just going to use this style guide. You're welcome to use Microsoft's or other folks. Just use one. It's good. I also want to give a quick shout out to for my book and Heidi's book. I see that Heidi is here. Hello. We co-authored a book on documentation called Docs for Developers, a engineer's field guide to technical writing. Please support us, buy it, it's useful. We're also creating a course based on the book content, and we have a wait list for that. So feel free to sign up, and that link will be shared when the slides are shared with everyone. And last, there's a lot of questions that you might have. You might want to join a community of people who do the work that Michelle and I focus on when it comes to documentation. And Write the Docs is an amazing community of technical writers and UX writers and software engineers who are focused on documentation. So I highly recommend their community and their conferences. And they also have a lot of local meetups if you're looking for something local. So those will all be shared with you when the slides are shared.
Thanks so much. And I'm looking forward to the discussion and hearing about everyone else's experience with documentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Jared and Michelle. All right, so we're going to jump over now to the Lean Coffee discussion. So we've dropped the link to the Lean Coffee board into the chat. You can hop over there and you can go ahead, just join as a guest. No need to sign in. And then as you're starting to add your topics, if you're new to Lean Coffee, what we're going to do here for the next minute and a half, 2 minutes, is we're going to add topics to the board. Then we're going to spend a minute to vote on which topics we want to discuss. Each of you have 3 votes. And then I will start the discussion. We'll start with the topic that gets the most votes. And then you will see, you'll get an opportunity to vote if you want to keep talking about it, don't have an opinion, or you're ready to move on. And we'll move through the topics until we run out of time. We always typically run out of time before we run out of topics. And to participate today, I encourage you to join the conversation. You can do that by raising your hand using the Meet feature. You can do that by putting information and thoughts in the chat. And you can also add notes to the Lean Coffee board itself. I encourage us all to be thoughtful. We want to get as many voices in as possible. At times, if you've spoken a couple times already and I see someone who has raised their hand for the first time, I might hop over, go to them first, and then come back to you. And I appreciate your understanding with that. So if you can start adding your topics. And so I'm going to give another minute for adding topics, and then we'll start voting. In the interest of time, I'm going to talk about some things that we've got coming up. So then we will just kind of end on our discussion today. But as you're adding topics, we do have next week, we've got 3 opportunities for community connections. These are still going to be just 30 minutes for the month of July. And that's where you just come, we break you into small groups, meet one another, and make some connections. On the 27th, we're going to be having a lean coffee discussion around the roles and team structure when you're trying to improve your software delivery, when you're implementing a DevOps culture. And then we'll have another lean coffee in the beginning of August around kind of similar ideas. And that's all leading up to our lean coffee on August 24th, where Matthew Skelton, author of Team Topologies, is going to join us for a lean coffee discussion. So if everyone now wants to start voting, I will give you a minute to vote, and then we will start our discussion.